The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the general store, sending up a cloud of dust that coated everything within 20 feet, and Florence Norris pressed her gloved hand against the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack through her ribs. This was Dalhart, Texas, a speck of civilization carved out of the endless prairie in 1883, and somewhere in this dusty town was the man she'd been writing to for 6 months, the man who'd promised her a new life far from the suffocating parlors of Boston, where her future had been mapped out like a sentence rather than a promise. She stepped down from the coach, her traveling dress wrinkled beyond redemption, her auburn hair escaping its pins despite her best efforts during the journey. The heat hit her like a physical force, so different from the damp New England summers she'd known all her 22 years. Around her, Dalhart spread out in all its rough glory, wooden buildings lining a wide dirt street, horses tied to hitching posts, men in dust-covered clothes moving with purpose or lounging in the shade. "Miss Norris." The voice came from behind her, deep and uncertain, and Florence turned to find a tall man standing with his hat in his hands, his dark hair damp with sweat, his eyes the color of summer grass fixed on her face with an expression caught between hope and terror. "Mr. Fletcher?" she asked, though she knew it must be him. Harrison Fletcher, the cowboy who'd answered her brother's advertisement on her behalf, who'd written letters full of careful words about his ranch and his dreams and his loneliness. "Yes, madam, Harrison. Just Harrison, if you please." He shifted his weight, looking younger than his 26 years despite the weathered quality of his skin, the calluses she could see on his hands. "Welcome to Dalhart. I hope the journey wasn't too terrible." "It was long," Florence admitted, accepting his help as he reached for her trunk. "But I'm here now, and I'm grateful for that much." They walked together toward a wagon, and Florence noticed the looks they were getting from people on the street, some curious, some knowing, a few openly skeptical. She lifted her chin and kept her eyes forward. She'd made her choice when she'd answered Harrison's letter, when she'd told him about the dream that had kept her awake at night since childhood. The dream of teaching children in a place where education was scarce and precious. "I brought the wagon instead of the buggy," Harrison was saying as he loaded her trunk with easy strength. "Figured you might have more belongings than would fit comfortable in something smaller." That was thoughtful. Florence climbed up onto the seat, arranging her skirts. "How far is your ranch?" "About 5 miles west. It's not much yet, but I've been building it up these past 4 years. Got a good herd going, decent grazing land, a house that's sturdy even if it's plain." He swung up beside her and took the reins, and the wagon lurched into motion. "I want you to know, Miss Norris, that I meant what I wrote in my letters. About your teaching, I mean. There's no school here in Dalhart, and the nearest one's 20 miles away. Folks with children have been teaching them at home if they've got the learning themselves, but most don't. If you still want to start a school, I'll help however I can." Florence felt something loosen in her chest. She'd been afraid, despite his written promises, that he might have changed his mind once faced with the reality of having a bride with ambitions beyond keeping house. "I do want that," she said quietly. "More than anything. I was trained as a teacher in Boston, but there were so many teachers and so few positions, and all of them already filled by people with connections I didn't have. When my brother showed me your letter, and you seemed open to the idea of a wife who wanted to teach, it felt like Providence." Harrison glanced at her, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Providence or desperation on both our parts, maybe, but I figure that's as good a foundation as any." The honesty of it made Florence laugh, a real laugh that surprised her. "Perhaps you're right." They rode in companionable silence for a while, and Florence watched the landscape roll past, so vast and open it made her feel simultaneously free and terrified. She'd never seen so much sky, never been anywhere without the press of buildings and people hemming her in. Here, the grass rippled like water to the horizon, broken only by occasional clusters of cattle and the distant silhouettes of other ranches. "That's the Morrison place," Harrison said, pointing to a cluster of buildings to the north. "Good people. They've got 3 children who'd benefit from schooling, and beyond them, about 2 miles further, the Cartwrights have 5 kids, all stair-stepped from 6 to 14. "You've been thinking about this," Florence observed. "I have." He seemed almost embarrassed to admit it. "Your letters, the way you wrote about teaching, about how every child deserves a chance to learn regardless of their circumstances, it reminded me of my own mother. She taught me and my sisters to read and write, and she always said it was the greatest gift she could give us. She passed when I was 16, and I've thought about her a lot these past months, reading your words." Florence felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was. I think she would have liked you." They turned onto a smaller track, and soon buildings appeared ahead, modest but well-maintained. A barn, several outbuildings, corrals with horses, and a house that was indeed plain but solid, with a covered porch and real glass windows. Florence had half expected something more primitive, and her relief must have shown on her face. "I know it's not fancy," Harrison said quickly. "But it's tight against the weather, and I've been adding to it. There's 2 bedrooms now, so you'll have privacy until you're comfortable with other arrangements." Florence felt her cheeks heat. The marriage was legal, arranged by proxy before she'd left Boston, but they'd agreed in their letters to let familiarity come naturally. "That's very considerate." He helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside. The interior was neat, surprisingly so for a bachelor's dwelling, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a table with 4 chairs, a stove that looked well-maintained, and windows that let in good light. The wooden floors were swept clean, and someone had put wildflowers in a jar on the table. "I wanted it to look welcoming," Harrison said, following her gaze to the flowers. "I know this isn't what you're used to, coming from Boston and all." "It's lovely," Florence said, and meant it. There was something honest about the space, unpretentious and real in a way her family's Boston townhouse had never been, with its heavy drapes and cluttered rooms designed to impress rather than comfort. "Thank you for going to such trouble." Over the next few days, they developed a careful routine. Harrison woke before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, while Florence explored the house and began to understand its rhythms. She cooked meals from the supplies in the pantry, discovering that Harrison had laid in a surprising variety of goods. They ate together morning and evening, and during those meals, they talked. Harrison told her about coming to Texas from Missouri, about working as a hired hand until he'd saved enough to buy this land, about his vision of building something lasting. Florence told him about Boston, about her family's expectations that she'd marry a businessman her father had chosen, about sneaking away to the teacher's college against her parents' wishes. "They cut me off when they found out," she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky impossible colors. "Said I was ungrateful and rebellious. My brother was the only one who stayed in contact, and even he had to be careful about it. When he showed me your letter, he said it was my chance to have what I wanted on my own terms." "Do you miss them?" Harrison asked. Florence considered the question honestly. "I miss what I wished they could be. But I don't miss the constant criticism, the feeling that nothing I did would ever be good enough unless I completely surrendered what I wanted for myself." "Then I'm glad you came here," Harrison said quietly. "I know we barely know each other, but I want you to know that I'll never ask you to be less than you are. You want to teach, That's a good thing. You want to help these children learn. That's something worth doing. And if you decide this life isn't for you, if you want to go back east, I won't hold you to vows made through letters and lawyers." Florence turned to look at him in the fading light. His profile was strong, his expression sincere, and she felt a flutter of something in her chest that was more than gratitude. "I don't want to go back," she said. "I want to build something here, with you if you'll have me." He met her eyes then, and she saw hope there, and warmth, and the beginning of something that might grow into more given time and care. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." The next day, Harrison took Florence into Dalhart to meet people and to begin discussing the possibility of a school. They started at the general store, where the owner, a shrewd-eyed woman named Mrs. Patterson, looked Florence up and down with obvious assessment. "So you're the mail-order bride Harrison's been waiting on," she said without preamble. "He tells me you want to start a school." "I do," Florence said, refusing to be intimidated. "I have training as a teacher, and I understand there are many children in the area who have no access to education." "That's true enough." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "My own grandson is 7 and sharp as a tack, but his mother can barely read herself, let alone teach him. If you're serious about this, you'll have support from the families. Question is where you'd hold classes and how you'd get the supplies you'd need." "I've been thinking about that," Harrison interjected. "There's the old line shack on the eastern edge of my property. It's not being used for anything now. With some work, it could be converted into a schoolhouse. Single room, but it would be enough to start." Florence looked at him in surprise. He hadn't mentioned this idea to her, and she felt a rush of affection for his initiative. "That could work," she said slowly. "We'd need desks, books, slates, chalk." "I can help with the desks," said a voice from the doorway, and they turned to find a weathered man with carpenter's hands and a kind face. "Name's Jacob Morrison. Harrison pointed you out through the window. I've got 3 little ones who need schooling, and I'm handy with wood. Build you whatever furniture you need in exchange for teaching." "And I've got books," Mrs. Patterson said, warming to the idea. "My late husband was a reading man, and I've got crates of books in the storeroom I've never known what to do with. Readers, arithmetic books, even some geography and history. You're welcome to them." Within an hour, word had spread through the small town, and Florence found herself surrounded by parents eager to discuss the possibility of a school. Some offered labor, others materials. A few promised provisions to help support the venture. Harrison stood beside her the entire time, his presence steady and supportive, occasionally offering practical suggestions but mostly letting Florence take the lead. By the time they headed back to the ranch that afternoon, Florence felt dizzy with possibility and excitement. "I can hardly believe it," she said. "In Boston, I spent 2 years trying to secure a teaching position and was rejected at every turn. Here, in a single morning, I have students and a schoolhouse and support. People here understand the value of things," Harrison said. "They know what it costs to be without learning, and they want better for their children. You're offering them something precious." "We're offering them something," Florence corrected. "This wouldn't be possible without you, without your land and your willingness to help." Harrison was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want you to know this isn't just me trying to make you happy so you'll stay. I believe in what you're doing. I've seen what happens to people out here who can't read or figure, how they get cheated by unscrupulous merchants, how they can't read the notices from the government or understand their rights. Education is freedom, and you're right to want to give these children that chance." Florence felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding." Over the following weeks, the schoolhouse took shape. Harrison and several other men spent their evenings and Sundays converting the line shack, expanding it slightly, adding real windows, building a porch to keep the weather off. Jacob Morrison crafted desks sized for children of various ages, rough but sturdy, and his wife sewed cushions for them from flour sacks. Mrs. Patterson donated not just books but slates and chalk, a large map of the United States that was only slightly outdated, even a small globe that had belonged to her husband. Florence worked alongside the men when she could, painting the interior walls with whitewash, helping to install shelves for the books, sewing curtains for the windows. In the evenings, she and Harrison would sit together and plan the curriculum, discussing what subjects to teach and how to accommodate students of different ages and abilities in a single room. During those evenings, Florence began to see deeper into Harrison's character. He was thoughtful and patient, quick to laugh but also comfortable with silence. He asked her opinions and listened to her answers, never dismissing her ideas even when he disagreed. He told her stories about the ranch, about the challenges of building a life in country that could be harsh and unforgiving, but also about the satisfaction of seeing something grow from nothing through hard work and determination. "I was so lonely before," he admitted one night. "I didn't realize how much until I started getting your letters. Having someone to share the day with, to talk about ideas and dreams, it reminded me that there's more to life than just surviving." Florence reached out and took his hand, the gesture feeling natural now after weeks of growing closeness. "I was lonely too, surrounded by people in Boston but completely alone because none of them truly knew me or cared to. Here, I feel like I can be myself, and that's a gift I never expected." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm falling in love with you, Florence. I don't know if it's too soon to say that, but it's true. You're brave and kind and passionate about things that matter, and every day I thank whatever fortune brought you here." Florence felt her heart expand. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said softly. "When I answered your letter, I hoped for compatibility, for a partnership that would let me pursue my dreams. I never imagined I'd find someone who would make me feel the way you do." Harrison leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Florence didn't pull away. She met him halfway, and their first kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and care. When they parted, both were smiling. "I'd like you to move into the main bedroom," Harrison said. "If you're ready. If not, I understand, but I'd like to be a proper husband to you, Florence, in all ways." "I'd like that too," Florence said, her cheeks warm but her voice steady. "I'm ready." That night, they came together as husband and wife fully for the first time, and it was tender and uncertain and beautiful. Afterward, lying in Harrison's arms, Florence felt a peace she'd never known before, a sense of rightness that went bone deep. The school opened on a Monday morning in late September, when the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before the winter cold set in. 13 children arrived that first day, ranging in age from 5 to 14, brought by parents who stayed to see what this Boston teacher would do with their offspring. Florence stood at the front of the schoolroom in a simple dress, her hair pinned neatly, her hands steady despite her nerves. "Good morning," she said clearly. "My name is Mrs. Fletcher, and I'm very pleased to meet all of you. This school exists because your parents love you and want you to have opportunities they may not have had. We'll work hard here, but we'll also discover that learning is one of life's great joys." She divided the children into 3 groups by age and ability, and began with the youngest, teaching them the alphabet through a song while the older children practiced their letters on slates. By mid-morning, she had them all engaged, even the 14-year-old boy who'd arrived with a sullen expression, but was now puzzling through a geography lesson with genuine interest. Harrison appeared at noon with lunch for Florence, and she took a brief break while the children ate their own meals outside. "How's it going?" he asked, watching the children through the window. "Better than I dared hope," Florence said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "They're eager, Harrison. Even the ones who claimed they didn't care about learning are curious and engaged. This is everything I dreamed of." "You're everything I dreamed of," Harrison said, pulling her close for a quick kiss. "Watching you with those children, seeing how you light up, it makes me love you even more." The autumn weeks passed quickly, marked by the rhythms of school and ranch life. Florence taught Monday through Friday, arriving early to warm the schoolhouse and staying late to plan lessons. Harrison managed the ranch, but made time to visit the school most days, often helping with repairs or bringing firewood to keep the room warm as the weather cooled. On weekends, they worked together on the ranch, with Florence learning to help with various tasks and Harrison continuing to improve their home. The children progressed rapidly. Even the oldest, a boy named Thomas who'd never had formal schooling, began to read with increasing fluency. His younger sister Mary showed a gift for mathematics, and the youngest children absorbed everything like sponges, their minds hungry for knowledge. The community embraced the school wholeheartedly. Parents who'd been skeptical at first became enthusiastic supporters when they saw their children learning. Several women formed a committee to support the school, organizing donations of supplies and even raising money to purchase additional books from a catalog. As winter approached, Harrison began talking about expanding the ranch. "If things keep going well," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Florence grading papers while he mended tack, "I'd like to bring in more cattle in the spring. Maybe hire a hand or two to help. The ranch is getting too big for one man to manage alone, especially with you occupied with teaching." "Can we afford that?" Florence asked, practical despite her general ignorance of ranch finances. "With careful planning, yes, and it would mean more security for us for our future." He paused, then added, "I've been thinking about the future a lot lately, about children of our own, about building something we can pass on." Florence set down her papers. "I've been thinking about that too, about what kind of life we're creating here, what it would mean to bring children into it." "And what do you think?" Harrison asked, his eyes hopeful. "I think this is exactly the kind of place I'd want to raise a family, where there's room to grow, where education is valued, where people help each other." She smiled at him. "I think I'd like very much to have children with you, Harrison Fletcher." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "You've made me happier than I ever thought possible," he murmured against her hair. "When that stagecoach arrived 6 months ago, I was terrified you'd take one look at me and Dalhart and want to get right back on and head home. Instead, you've made this place more of a home than it ever was before." "You made my dream come true," Florence said, pulling back to look at him. "You promised in your letters that if I came here, you'd help me start a school, and you did. You've supported me every step of the way, never making me feel like my ambitions were less important than yours. How could I not love you for that?" They kissed, and the kiss deepened, and the papers remained ungraded that night as they retired early to their bedroom. Their love expressed in touches and whispers, and the quiet intimacy of two people who'd found in each other something rare and precious. Winter set in with determination, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. The schoolhouse, well built though it was, became drafty, and Harrison spent precious resources to improve the insulation and ensure the stove could keep the children warm. Some days, when the weather was particularly bad, school was canceled, but Florence used those days to visit families individually, checking on her students' progress and leaving assignments for them to complete at home. During one such visit to the Morrison family, Florence discovered that Jacob's wife, Sarah, was struggling. The woman was pale and thin, and the house, though tidy, showed signs of strain. The younger children looked underfed, and when Florence gently inquired, Sarah broke down in tears. "Jacob's been sick," she admitted. "Nothing serious, just a cough he can't shake, but it's kept him from taking on as much carpentry work as usual. We're behind on buying supplies, and I don't know how we'll manage the winter." Florence was horrified. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you come to us for help?" "Pride, I suppose," Sarah said, wiping her eyes, "and not wanting to burden anyone. Everyone has their own troubles." "That's what community is for," Florence said firmly, "to help each other through the hard times. I'm going to talk to Harrison, and we'll figure something out." That evening, Florence told Harrison about the Morrisons' situation. His reaction was immediate. "We'll take them some provisions tomorrow. And I'll talk to some of the other ranchers about getting Jacob some work he can do indoors until he's better. No family should go hungry, especially not one that's helped us so much." Within days, the community had rallied around the Morrisons. Harrison and several others brought supplies, enough to see them through the winter. Mrs. Patterson extended credit at the store, and several people found indoor work for Jacob that wouldn't strain his health, mending tack and repairing furniture and doing other skilled work that kept him earning. The incident reinforced for Florence how different life was here compared to Boston. In the city, neighbors had been strangers and poverty was shameful, something to be hidden. Here, people acknowledged that hardship could strike anyone, and helping each other was simply what decent people did. As Christmas approached, Florence organized a school program, with the children performing recitations and songs they'd learned. The entire community turned out, cramming into the schoolhouse to watch their children demonstrate their learning. Thomas read a passage from Dickens with only minor stumbles. Mary solved mathematics problems on the blackboard, and the youngest children sang carols. Afterward, there was a potluck meal, with every family contributing what they could. It wasn't fancy, but it was abundant and joyful, and Florence stood beside Harrison watching the celebration and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "A year ago, I was sitting in my parents' parlor in Boston, dreading Christmas because I knew it would be full of judgment and criticism," she said quietly. "Now I'm here, surrounded by people who have become like family, doing work I love with a man I love. It doesn't seem quite real." "It's real," Harrison assured her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "And it's only going to get better, I promise you that." On Christmas morning, Harrison gave Florence a gift that made her cry. It was a sign for the schoolhouse, beautifully carved and painted, reading Fletcher School with the date of its founding. "You built this place," Harrison said as Florence traced the letters with her fingers. "Your vision, your hard work, your dedication. It should bear your name, our name." "It's perfect," Florence whispered. "Thank you." Her gift to him was more practical but no less heartfelt. A new saddle she'd commissioned from a leather worker in the next town. Using money she'd saved from small payments, some of the wealthier families had insisted on making for their children's education. Harrison was moved almost to tears by the gesture and the sacrifice it represented. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Florence realized with quiet certainty that she was pregnant. She waited until she was sure before telling Harrison, and when she did, his joy was boundless. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down gently as if she were made of glass. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Florence asked, though she could see the answer in his face. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Thrilled, grateful, terrified, everything all at once. He placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach. "When? Late summer, I think. August or early September. You'll have to take time away from teaching. I know, I've been thinking about that. I can teach through June, then take the summer and early fall to have the baby and recover. If I can find someone to help, I could potentially start again by late October. As it turned out, finding help wasn't difficult. A young woman named Emily, who'd been one of Florence's best students before her family had moved to Dalhart from Kansas, volunteered to assist. At 18, she'd completed as much education as was available and was hungry for purpose. Under Florence's tutelage, she began learning how to teach, starting by helping with the younger children. "You're a natural," Florence told her after watching her lead a reading lesson. "Have you thought about becoming a teacher yourself?" "I didn't think it was possible for someone like me," Emily admitted. "We don't have much money, and I always assumed teaching was for people with fancy educations from back east. Teaching is for anyone with patience, knowledge, and a desire to help children learn," Florence said firmly. "You have all three. Keep working with me, and by the time I have this baby, you'll be ready to manage the school on your own for a few months." Spring brought not just new life to the prairie, but also growth for the ranch. True to his plans, Harrison expanded the herd and hired 2 hands to help manage the increased workload. The ranch was prospering, and with prosperity came more stability and security. Florence taught through June as planned, though the heat and her growing belly made it increasingly challenging. The children were sweet about it, the older ones helping more with the younger ones, all of them excited about their teacher having a baby. On the last day before summer break, they presented her with gifts they'd made: drawings, a quilt pieced together from scraps, wildflowers picked from the prairie. "We'll miss you, Mrs. Fletcher," Thomas said, speaking for the group, "but we're grateful for everything you've taught us." "My pa says I read better than he does now, and I'm only 14. "You've all worked so hard," Florence said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of every one of you. Keep reading over the summer, keep practicing your mathematics, and when school starts again in the fall, Miss Emily will be here to continue your education." Summer was both restful and busy. Florence spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing clothes and blankets, while Harrison finished converting the second bedroom into a nursery. The community, as always, rallied around, with women bringing baby items they no longer needed and offering advice about childbirth and infant care. Mrs. Patterson, who delivered many babies in her time, agreed to attend the birth, and Sarah Morrison offered to help as well. Florence, who'd been nervous about giving birth so far from city doctors and hospitals, found comfort in the capable hands and experienced wisdom of these frontier women. The baby came on a sweltering afternoon in late August, arriving after a labor that was long but mercifully uncomplicated. Florence would never forget the moment the midwife placed her son in her arms, his tiny face red and wrinkled, his cries strong and healthy. "A boy," Harrison said in wonder, his voice breaking as he looked at his son. "We have a son, Florence. They named him Henry after Harrison's father, and he was perfect." Florence recovered well from the birth, and within weeks, she felt strong enough to take short walks around the ranch with the baby. Harrison was a devoted father, taking every opportunity to hold his son, talking to him constantly even though Henry was far too young to understand. "I want him to know my voice," Harrison explained when Florence teased him about his endless monologues. "I want him to grow up knowing he's loved and wanted." Emily managed the school beautifully when it reopened in September, and Florence visited when she could, bringing Henry along. The children were enchanted with the baby, and the older girls especially loved being allowed to hold him carefully under Florence's watchful eye. By October, Florence was ready to return to teaching part-time. sharing responsibilities with Emily and bringing Henry to school with her. The arrangement worked surprisingly well, with the older students taking turns watching the baby when he was awake and Florence able to nurse him as needed. "I never imagined it could be like this," Florence told Harrison one evening as they sat on the porch, Henry asleep in her arms, watching the sunset. "Having both things I love, teaching and family, I thought I'd have to choose." "You've created something special here," Harrison said. "Not just the school, but a whole new way of thinking about what's possible. Other women are watching you, seeing that they don't have to give up their dreams when they have children." Indeed, several women in the community had begun talking about their own ambitions. One wanted to start a lending library, another hoped to open a dress shop, a third had begun selling her baked goods and was making a small but steady income. Florence's example had shown them that women could be wives and mothers and still pursue meaningful work beyond the home. The years that followed were full and rich. Henry grew into a bright, curious toddler who loved books and horses equally. The school continued to thrive, with Emily becoming a full partner in teaching as enrollment grew to over 20 students. Harrison's ranch became one of the most successful in the area, providing a comfortable living for the family. When Henry was 3, Florence became pregnant again, and this time she delivered a daughter they named Helen. 2 years after that, another son arrived whom they called James. The house Harrison had built grew with the family, expanding to accommodate the needs of 3 children and the various activities of a busy household. Florence continued teaching, though she adjusted her schedule as needed to care for her growing family. Emily proved invaluable, eventually taking over as the primary teacher, while Florence focused on curriculum development and special instruction for advanced students. When Emily married a local rancher and had children of her own, she brought them to school with her, continuing the tradition Florence had started. The school itself expanded beyond the converted line shack. When Florence's students outgrew the single room, the community came together to build a proper schoolhouse in Dalhart itself, a 2-room building with a bell tower and a small library. Florence was asked to serve on the county education board, a position she accepted with pride, using her influence to advocate for schools throughout the region. Throughout it all, Florence and Harrison's love continued to deepen. They faced challenges, certainly, years when drought threatened the ranch or illness swept through the community. But they faced everything together, their partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection that had only grown stronger with time. On their 10th anniversary, Harrison took Florence back to the spot where the line shack had stood, now just a cleared area on the eastern edge of their property. "This is where it all started," he said, holding her hand. "Where you began teaching, where you started making your dream real." "Where you helped me make it real," Florence corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Harrison. You've kept every promise you made in those letters and so many promises you never even spoke aloud." "I told you I'd make your dream come true," Harrison said, pulling her close. "But what I didn't realize was that you'd make dreams come true for this entire community." "You've changed so many lives, Florence, not just the children you've taught but their families, other women who have found courage in your example, even men like me who have learned that supporting a wife's ambitions doesn't diminish us but enriches us." Florence felt tears on her cheeks. "I was so afraid when I got off that stagecoach 10 years ago. I was trying to be brave, but mostly I was terrified that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd traded one form of confinement for another. And instead I found freedom, I found purpose, I found you. I found a home in the truest sense, not just a place but a life that fits me perfectly." They stood together as the sun set over the prairie, the same vast sky that had intimidated Florence a decade earlier now familiar and beloved. In the distance, they could see their house, light glowing in the windows where their children were being watched by Sarah Morrison's daughter, herself now grown and married. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the promise of warmth and supper and family. The town of Dalhart had grown too, no longer just a dusty collection of buildings but a real community with churches and shops and schools, plural now, as the population expanded. Florence's school had been the seed from which much of that growth had come, proving that investment in education brought prosperity and stability. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Florence thought about the girl she'd been in Boston, desperate and determined, willing to travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger for the chance to teach. That girl could never have imagined how much she'd find in Texas, how the dream she'd carried had been just the beginning. "What are you thinking?" Harrison asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "That I'm grateful, that I'm happy. That every risk I took, every moment of fear and uncertainty was worth it to get to this life, this moment with you." Inside the house, their children's laughter rang out and Florence smiled. Henry would be 9 soon, old enough to start helping more on the ranch, though he showed more interest in books than cattle. Helen at 6 was her mother's daughter, already teaching her younger brother his letters. James at 4 was pure mischief and joy, keeping everyone on their toes. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and triumphs. Henry did indeed prefer books to ranching, and with his parents' full support, he eventually went east to attend university, becoming a lawyer who specialized in water rights, a crucial issue for Texas ranchers. He returned to practice in Texas, never forgetting his roots. Helen became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over leadership of the original school when Florence finally retired in her 50s. She married a teacher from another district, and together they expanded educational opportunities throughout the region. James surprised everyone by showing a gift for veterinary medicine, studying under the local animal doctor, before going to veterinary college and returning to Dalhart to establish a practice that served ranchers throughout the county. Florence and Harrison watched their children grow and thrive with deep satisfaction, knowing they'd given them both roots and wings, stability and freedom to pursue their own dreams. As they grew older, the ranch passed into James's capable hands, with him managing it alongside his veterinary practice. Harrison and Florence moved into a smaller house in town, close to the school that still bore Florence's name, though it had been expanded and improved many times over the years. In their 60s, they were seen daily walking together through Dalhart, stopping to talk with old friends, watching new generations of children learn and grow. The community they'd helped build had become something neither could have imagined that day when Florence stepped off the stagecoach, uncertain and hopeful. "You ever regret it?" Florence asked Harrison one evening as they sat on their porch in town, older now but still holding hands like newlyweds. "Taking a chance on a mail-order bride, letting her turn your quiet ranch life into something so much more complicated." Harrison laughed, the sound still warm and genuine after all their years together. "Not for a single second. You gave me everything, Florence. Love, family, purpose, a life full of meaning. I was existing before you came. After you arrived, I started truly living." "We were both brave that day," Florence reflected. "You, opening your home and heart to a stranger. Me, traveling so far on nothing but hope and determination. But we were also lucky, finding in each other exactly the partner we needed." "Not luck," Harrison disagreed gently. "Providence. You said that word the first day we met, and I think you were right. Something larger than chance brought you here, brought us together, gave us this life." They sat in comfortable silence as evening fell over Dalhart, the town settling into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere down the street, a child practiced piano, the notes floating through the still air. A wagon rattled past, the driver waving. A dog barked and another answered. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary town, but to Florence it was everything. This life she'd built, this community she'd helped create, this love she'd found. It was all beyond anything she could have dreamed sitting in that Boston parlor so many years ago, desperate for escape and opportunity. The stagecoach that brought her to Dalhart had carried more than just a young woman and her belongings. It had carried hope and determination and dreams, and those intangible things had taken root in the Texas soil and grown into something beautiful and lasting. Florence and Harrison lived to see their grandchildren grow, to celebrate 50 years of marriage, to witness the continuing growth and prosperity of Dalhart and the surrounding communities. The school Florence had started educated hundreds of children over the decades, many of whom went on to achieve things their parents could never have imagined. When Florence finally passed away at the age of 76, the entire town mourned. The funeral was held in the largest church, and it overflowed with people whose lives she'd touched. Former students, now adults with children of their own, spoke of how she'd changed their trajectories, how her belief in the power of education had opened doors they'd never known existed. Harrison sat in the front pew, his children and grandchildren around him, and listened to the testimonies with tears streaming down his weathered face. His Florence, his brave, determined, loving Florence, had made such a difference. The scared young woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach had become a pillar of the community, a force for good, a beloved teacher and mentor and friend. He lived 3 more years without her, years that felt empty despite being surrounded by family. He spent his time writing down the story of their life together, wanting his grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know how their grandmother had arrived with a dream and built something extraordinary. When Harrison died at 79, he was buried beside Florence in the Dalhart Cemetery, under a headstone that read Harrison Fletcher, beloved husband, father, and friend. He made dreams come true. At the funeral, Helen read from her father's memoir, the story of the mail-order bride and the cowboy who'd promised to help her teach, who'd kept that promise and found love in the process. There wasn't a dry eye in the church as she described their first meeting, their courtship, the building of the school, the life they'd created together. "My parents' story," Helen said, closing the leather-bound book her father had filled with his careful handwriting, "is a story about courage and trust and the power of partnership. My mother came here with a dream, and my father said he'd make it come true. But what happened was even better than either of them planned. They made each other's dreams come true, and in doing so, they helped countless others achieve their dreams too. That's the legacy they've left us, the example of lives well lived in service to each other and their community." The Fletcher School continued for many more decades, eventually becoming part of the Dalhart public school system, but retaining its name in honor of the woman who'd founded it. The story of Florence and Harrison became local legend, told and retold, inspiring new generations to believe in the power of dreams and determination. The ranch they'd built still stood, passed down through the family, a testament to hard work and vision. The house, expanded and modernized over the years, remained a gathering place for family celebrations, its walls holding memories of love and laughter spanning generations. In time, Dalhart grew from a small frontier town into a thriving city, but it never forgot its roots. The original schoolhouse, carefully preserved, became a museum dedicated to the history of education in the region, with Florence's story prominently featured. Visitors could see her teaching materials, read her letters, view photographs of her with her students, and understand the impact one determined woman and her supportive husband had made. The story of the mail-order bride who arrived with a dream and the cowboy who promised to make it come true became more than just local history. It became a symbol of what was possible when people supported each other's ambitions, when love was built on respect and partnership, when dreams were pursued with courage and determination. Florence had wanted to teach, and she'd taught hundreds. But her greatest lesson wasn't found in any textbook. It was the lesson of her life itself, showing everyone who knew her story that it was possible to reach for your dreams, to find love in unexpected places, to build something meaningful and lasting through hard work and dedication and mutual support. The prairie wind still blew across the land where Florence and Harrison had lived and loved, carrying with it the echoes of children's laughter from the school, the memory of two people who'd found each other against the odds and created something beautiful together. Their story had ended, as all stories must, but what they'd built lived on in the community they'd helped create, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they'd left behind, in the example they'd set of lives lived with purpose and passion and abiding love. The stagecoach that had brought Florence to Dalhart was long gone, rotted away or sold for parts decades earlier. But the journey it represented, the leap of faith it symbolized, remained vital and inspiring. Because Florence had dared to answer an advertisement, to travel into the unknown, to trust in a stranger's promise and her own abilities, countless lives had been enriched and improved. And because Harrison had dared to open his heart to a mail-order bride, to support her dreams even when they complicated his life, to love her not despite her ambitions but because of them, he'd found a partnership richer and more fulfilling than he'd ever imagined possible. Their story was complete, beginning with uncertainty and ending with a legacy that would endure for generations. It was a story of the American West, of education and opportunity, of community and family. But most of all, it was a love story, as simple and profound as any ever told, about two people who found in each other exactly what they needed and built together a life of meaning, purpose, and enduring love.